Thank you for joining us today. I hope everyone is keeping well and no doubt looking forward to some well-deserved time off during the Christmas break. I, for one, am certainly starting to experience some lockdown fatigue, to say the least. By way of introduction, my name is Richard Barnwell and I'm a partner within BDO's Financial Services Advisory Practice. I work with clients across the financial sector on a range of regulatory advisory work, and I'm also a skilled person under FUSMA, so that means I do quite a lot of Section 166 work with the FCA and also the PRA. My main focus is on governance, risk management and culture across the FS sector, and in particular over the last 12 months I've been working quite a lot in the Lloyds market and the broader insurance sector. Lauren, can you just move to the next slide for me? I'm delighted to be joined today by a few guest speakers. So we have Julia Tyson, who's the Chief HR Officer at Lloyds, and also Lindsay Deeves, who's a Senior Manager working on syndicate capability oversight, also from Lloyds. My colleague Charles Portsmouth, who's a Director within the Financial Services Advisory Team at BDO, also has a short slot, and also Clive Martin, who's an experienced ex-Big Four partner in the FS sector, and he's going to be talking about the ever-evolving topic of culture. Over the past year, through our work on skilled person reviews, we've observed a real increased interest and number of requirement notices on Section 166s that have actually focused on culture, and these have been absolutely across the insurance sector. So I think what this highlights is that culture continues to very much be a high priority focus area for the UK regulator, not only the FCA but also the PRA, and obviously the further initiatives that we're seeing coming out of Lloyds of London, in particular with their culture framework and toolkit, very much highlight that this is an area that we should all be focusing on. So can you move on to the next slide, please? So we've got quite a lot to cover within the next hour. Julia and Lindsay are going to talk in a bit more detail about the Lloyds initiatives around strengthening culture within the insurance sector.
Apologies all, I think Richard may have lost connection, but we're just covering the agenda. So yeah, Lindsay and Julia will discuss Lloyd's initiatives around strengthening culture within the insurance sector. Charles Portsmouth will discuss our experience and insights of culture within the context of internal audit and risk management. And then finally, Clive will cover change management, including what makes for a successful and genuine behavioural change programme within FS businesses. So before I hand over to Lloyd and to Lindsay, I just wanted to touch some housekeeping points. So firstly, today's webinar is going to be recorded and we will circulate the slides later. Your lines will be automatically muted throughout the webinar. Please, could you submit your questions to the panel throughout the sessions using the Q&A box on the bottom right-hand side. Please ensure that you send the questions to all panelists, and we'll try to cover as many of these as we can at the end of the webinar. And if you are having any problems with the sound, please let us know via the Q&A box. So without further ado, I'll hand over to yourself, Lindsay. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, Shrenik. Hello, everybody. Julia's having some technical problems, and I think our IT is kicking her out of Zoom. So I'm going to cover her bits off the bat, so bear with me. I recognize lots of names on the in the audience today. Lots I recognize, some I don't, but just to give a quick introduction. So my role is very much in oversight within Lloyds, very much focused on syndicate performance and capability. Up until recently, we've not really talked about culture in terms of a sort of managing agent syndicate capability, but over the last year or so, it's certainly started to inform lots of our conversations. And so me and my team have been very much involved in the development of the culture framework and more specifically the toolkit. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the wider sort of culture initiative and then a bit more about the toolkit in a bit more detail. Lauren, could I have the next slide? We've got there we go. So certainly over the last, I don't know, 18 months to 2 years, culture has started to form a really key part of the Lloyds priorities. Certainly as a Lloyds employee, whenever we have any sort of employee sort of get together, John Neal talks really sort of clearly and around culture as a really key priority. And those of you who go along to any sort of market messaging or presentations from John, you will have also heard about how key culture is in terms of one of Lloyd's focus areas. So we had just popped up a few quotes in there that came from various places. I think one of them is from our annual report. One of them is from Fiona Luck, who is our sort of non-exec member of the Lloyds Council, specifically focused around talent and culture. And she also chairs our culture advisory group. So certainly culture has become a really key kind of talking point for us internally at Lloyds, and certainly in terms of some of our external communications with you. Lauren, could I have the next slide? So this was Julia's slide that she was going to talk about in terms of the overall kind of culture initiative that's been ongoing for some time now, 18 months or so. And what we've done as part of that is to build out what we call the Lloyds Culture Framework. And throughout my part of the presentation, I'll be talking to you a bit about those 5 themes that sort of underpin the culture framework around leadership, ethics, respect, trust, and motivation. And that really sits at the heart of the framework itself. And then out of that, you'll probably be aware of the gender targets that were announced earlier this year. That's something that we're sort of collectively as a market working towards. The culture toolkit, which I'll be talking to you a little bit about, a bit more about in a few minutes. Building the culture dashboard that really gives us and you as a market a really good sense across a number of metrics on where we all sit in terms of various sort of culture, gender, ethnicity metrics, and the idea of that is that really helps you as businesses understand. I was going to try not to say on anyone on a journey today, but I've already failed. So, but to understand where you all are on your own journeys and how where you sit alongside your peers in the market. And then lastly, around sort of market oversight, and one of the things I'll be talking to you about is how we are really trying to balance our objectives around overseeing the market, but also facilitating you and ourselves as we move towards a more high-performing culture, and how we've aimed to strike that balance between not making this a regulatory requirement, but that it's something that that we all want to do collectively together. And next slide, please. So the next couple of slides, I've really just taken some extracts of the culture toolkit. We launched the culture toolkit officially, I think it was the beginning of October or end of September. And a bit of background as to how we got to where we got to. Right at the end of last year, we had been thinking about doing some sort of culture thematic review in the market, which was something we were going to do earlier in 2020. When COVID hit, we all had to sort of take a think of our priorities. And one of the ideas that we came up with was, instead of us doing a sort of thematic review, which those of you who've been involved in a thematic review in the past will know that that really means us coming out to a selection of managing agents and really sort of understanding your approaches to whatever the topic might be, and then sort of building that into a kind of report that we then share with the market. But once COVID hit earlier this year, we rethought that and thought actually what we could probably do and achieve the same outcome is to really sort of put our heads together internally and see if we can come up with something that can help the market rather than us come in and come in and review a selection of your organizations. And so we got involved with Accenture, who already had their own culture framework, and they really helped us build out our culture framework, which is based on theirs. But what we did is we spent a lot of time with a number of you in the market trying to make sure that the culture framework that we build is really appropriate to us as a market, and to draw out the things that we think as a market would be really key in terms of how we will collectively sort of build a stronger culture. And so we ended up choosing these 5 themes that we think are the 5 kind of main pillars for culture. One of the challenges that, well, certainly I've always had when talking about culture is it's a really difficult and intangible thing to get our heads around, and then also for us to then have sort of conversations where we're all using the same language. And what these 5 themes do is really sort of break up culture into something that we can all get our heads around and our hands around, and gives us some kind of consistent language, so that when we're all talking about culture, we're all talking about the same thing, and in a slightly more sort of bite-sized fashion. So, I mean, the 5 themes themselves, I mean, there's nothing really surprising in there. Leadership, ethics, respect, trust, and motivation. And all of these 5 themes are very much sort of interlinked. So just because something sits under one box doesn't mean that it doesn't sort of impact another box. On the leadership side, I guess it's not surprising that we would have leadership as one of our 5 main themes. And that's very much around the tone from the top, obviously, but also how does that tone from the top actually sort of manifest itself in your leadership styles, and how does that sort of filter down into the business. And so we've tried to draw out a few things there, things around, you know, there's a tone from the top, but what does that actually mean in terms of accountability? How are people being held accountable for their behaviors? And something, you'll see a phrase, and I'll probably say it a few times today, corporate bravery, which is something that we've spent a lot of time talking about. How do we, and you, really make those brave decisions as leaders when faced with, for example, a financially well-performing individual or team, but who might not be displaying the right sort of behaviors, and how do we take those tough decisions in a business that has a high-performing culture. Ethics, I think one of the things to draw out there is really again about how are we brave enough to make ethically sound decisions, and how do the ethics of the organization really flow through into our decision making and into how we expect our employees to be behaving. Similarly, on respect, we try to draw out the idea that, you know, respect goes both ways. It goes all the way up and down the various layers of an organization, so that all employees and colleagues are treated with respect, and that the sort of distribution of power isn't sort of skewed towards the more, you know, the more senior layers of an organization. Trust is a really key one with our Speaking Up campaigns that you'll probably be aware of. Trust is a really key element of this. I think we felt that given what we learned in the first culture survey around people not being comfortable with raising issues or not being confident in the businesses that they're in, that issues that they raise are really going to be seen through to the right outcome, is something that I think we felt that we really need to build into our framework. And then motivation, obviously, around how do we actually get the best of our employees, and what are our incentives, our remuneration packages, our recruitment policies, how are they really incentivizing our employees to be the best that they can be. So we thought that those 5 themes really kind of capture where we think we should be starting out in terms of the areas that we need to focus on in building a high-performing culture. Could I have the next slide, please? So many of you, since we launched the toolkit, might well have spent a bit of time kind of really getting into the detail of the toolkit, although I know we've got a real mix of people in the audience today. Some of you will have been sort of paging through the toolkit and getting right into the detail. Others, depending on your role, might just be aware of it, but may not have sort of really got into the detail. But I very much think that what we call our maturity checklists are really sit at the heart of our toolkit. So I've just taken an example of one just to put up on the screen, just to talk it through a little bit, because I think these are the parts of the toolkit that those of you who are sort of practitioners in this are going to find the most useful, as well as those of you who might be in the risk world or the internal audit world. You know, these are the things that I think will really help you do what you need to do to drive a high performing culture in your businesses. So for each of those 5 themes of the culture framework, there will be a maturity checklist that sort of sits underneath that. So the one that I've pulled up here is just the maturity checklist on leadership. And what we've aimed to do is really take on the left-hand side those what we call culture indicators, those sort of fairly intangible concepts, and try and build something slightly more tangible, something that you can kind of get your heads and hands around, to help you kind of stand back from your business and able to really reflect as to where you think you are on that sort of spectrum between what we've called a developing culture and a high performing culture. And obviously that's just a spectrum. There will be sort of points in between those 2 ends of the spectrum. And we spent quite a lot of time in building this, obviously with Accenture, but also with many of you in the market, really sort of bouncing around, getting the right, making sure that we weren't gold plating or building something that was then going to kind of create a huge, big sort of cottage industry. But also one of the big challenges that we've got, as you know, we've got a marketplace full of many, many different types of businesses in terms of size, in terms of how you all sit within a wide organizational structure. And we had to be quite careful to create something that is not a one size fits all, but will work for each of you as a business. And certainly we don't see these maturity checklists as being at all prescriptive, but the idea is that it'll help you all use the parts of these checklists that speak to you the most, and help you. You all know your own businesses really well, so it's a sort of pick and choose. You know, what are the things that you think as a business will help you get to where we all collectively want to be? And as I said, we've tried to make these as tangible as possible. There is a slide, or there's a sort of a part of the toolkit that also talks about evidence and KPIs, because we've tried to build for all of these, not for every bullet on here, but we've tried to give some ideas about what KPIs and what data you might want to use to really start to evidence some of these activities around building a culture. The other thing I guess to add is that I mean, these lists are not exhaustive. As we speak to you more as businesses about the work that you're doing on culture, you know, we will sort of revisit these, get your feedback as to whether you think that we've hit the right mark, or whether there's things on whether there might be parts of these checklists that we haven't included, but they're things that you might have done. So we very much see the toolkit sort of evolving as we all understand culture better, and also understand how all of us can really measure our own culture within our own organizations. So we certainly don't expect you to be able to sort of show us a whole lot of ticks down the side of any of these maturity checklists. My role is in oversight, so it's unsurprising that we'll want to sort of understand engagement with the toolkit rather than for you to be able to show us we're not expecting to come in and see a whole lot of tick boxes, but what we would want to see is get a real feel for the level of engagement that you've had with the toolkit, and what actions that might have driven within your own organizations. So as I said, that's just a sort of a snapshot of one of the maturity checklists, but there are a number of those sitting in the toolkit, which is on our website. So I would encourage you, if you haven't yet, to spend some time just looking at some of those. Could I have the next slide, please? Again, another extract from the toolkit. When we were thinking about different parts of organizations that are going to be key in driving a high-performing culture, we very much wanted to look at all parts of a business. This isn't just something that we think can be driven out of your HR function or just from your board. It's really got to sort of cut across the business. And so part of the toolkit just really speaks to different areas within the business and how we think, depending on your role, what your role would be in building that culture. So unsurprisingly, the board is on there, and ExCo and business leadership, and we very much would want to see sort of tangible buy-in to the toolkit and some sort of tangible proactive activity around building a high-performing culture. HRDs, unsurprisingly, very much at the heart of what all your organizations will be doing to build this. And then also risk management and internal audit. So in our role in oversight, many of you will know that we spend a lot of time talking to risk management professionals in the market, as well as internal audit. We very much rely on those second and third lines in terms of understanding what you as a business are focusing on, and how these different themes and topics are sort of building into risk management frameworks, as well as sort of internal audit plans. So I hope that the toolkit, particularly those maturity checklists, will really help those of you in the audience in the risk world and in the audit world in coming up with techniques and frameworks to enable you to really put culture at the heart of the work that you do. We spent a bit of time with in building the toolkit with the LMA Internal Audit Committee, really trying to understand how we take this concept like culture and how does that fit alongside an internal audit world, which is around sort of controls and processes and checking. And I mean, certainly we found that very useful in terms of understanding how culture can probably not be built in as a sort of a separate audit, but sort of can feed into audits across the business. And so you could embed culture audits into other audits that you do. Can I have is that my last slide? Oh, so just before I move on, I was just going to talk a little bit about, since we had built the toolkit and launched the toolkit, some of the market engagement that we've had. Julia has been spending the last couple of months visiting many of you in the audience have probably had one of those discussions with her. And I just wanted to pick up on some of the feedback that we've had on the overall culture work that we've been doing with the market based on those sort of market engagement discussions. I think very much there's a sense of the approach that we have taken on this in terms of going on the journey with us. There we go, I use the phrase again. But for Lloyds and all of you in the market, for us to really sort of support and equip and enable you on this culture initiative, rather than to come down hard in terms of oversight. I mean, I think eventually what we want to do is get to a point where culture is informing the decisions that we make at Lloyds in a way that other capabilities inform our decisions. And I think that probably applies to you as businesses as much as it does to us. So when you are recruiting and promoting and thinking about your own sort of underwriting business plans, how is culture informing those decisions? And we're going to be faced with those same challenges as well in terms of the decisions that we make around new entrants, around CPG business planning. How much should culture be informing those decisions? But we're not there yet. I think we're still at the beginning of our journey in terms of understanding how the market is really engaging with the culture initiative. What we also heard from the market is that a lot of you are really keen to share your own experiences and initiatives in buddy groups or roundtables, for example, where there might be a focus on pipeline build or women's mentoring. And we need to just, I guess, think about as part of our sort of facilitative approach, whether we work alongside the LMA or with a number of you here today about how we can help that sort of information sharing across businesses. The culture dashboards, which I mentioned just right at the beginning, but that certainly shone a focus on how important data is as part of this, and dashboards, data, KPIs, and what a key part of that this is going to be. And I think that's going to be something that we spend a bit more time thinking about. Hopefully the dashboards become more useful for you as businesses, but certainly for us to build high performing cultures across the market, data is going to be a really key element of that. And then there's the wider sort of well-being piece. So what we heard in these market engagement sessions was sort of related to culture is how important well-being has been, particularly this year in the response to COVID, and what that tells us about, or what that tells you about your own firm's culture, and how your own firms have really kind of embraced well-being and engagement initiatives throughout the COVID, or throughout 2020, really. So that was where I was going to stop. I think we're going to be taking questions right at the end rather than after each session. So I'm going to now hand back, and I will be around for questions at the end.
Thanks, Lindsay. Good afternoon to you all. And I've been asked to talk about what we're seeing in the market and how that feeds into the risk and the internal audit agenda. The insight comes from across the financial services industry and not just the insurance sector. Firstly, on a historical note, I think and believe that the insurance market has moved on and improved its culture from when I first got involved some 40 years ago. A couple of instances of the poor culture that I observed in the market around that time. I remember one insurance brokering client where there was a woman broker, and these were a rare species in those days. And I also remember the misogynistic remarks made behind her back as to how she placed the more difficult risks. And secondly, the insurance broker with the women in the organisation were very careful not to get into a lift alone with the chairman, a fact that was well known throughout the organisation, but was never addressed by anybody. However, as Lloyds has discovered, instances of poor culture have not been totally eradicated from our market, and we've heard from their team how they are addressing the issue of both firm culture and the wider topic of diversity and inclusion for participants in the Lloyds market. The advent of the senior managers regime and the related prescribed responsibility for culture has focused the senior management team on the need to ensure there is a good culture within the organisation. And this has meant that culture has moved up the priorities of the executive agenda and also up the topic list for non-executive directors. Firms realise that having a good and strong culture brings the business greater benefits, particularly with the younger generations and the increased use of social media. Reputational risk is personified in the cultural aspects to a business in terms of attracting and retaining the talent that it needs to prosper are increasingly both under scrutiny, and any issues can be shared and spread very easily through social media and the like. And this increased focus is leading to a more sophisticated and multifaceted approach to both promote and to measure culture and its effects on the business. There is now much less of a tick box approach, and it's moved up the agenda in the second and third lines of defence, as risk has recognised that culture is an important element of both the inherent people and strategic risks to the firm. And when we as a firm are asked to review culture through Section 166 reviews on governance and risk, and sometimes even directly on culture itself, it is evident that there is a virtuous circle to be applied. And this starts with what the FCA and others are now calling the purpose of the firm. Purpose is wider than the need for monetary profit and should include what the FCA calls good outcomes for customers, employees, and investors. This purpose needs to be embedded in the firm through tone from the top, simple and effective value statements leading to good behaviours and mindsets with good outcomes for the firm as a whole, and reinforcing that purpose. A good example of a purpose statement is to be found in the Markel style, as set out by the Markel Corporation. It's too long to set out in full here, but you can find it by using Google. This statement was not written yesterday, but was written over 30 years ago and has not been touched since. Next slide, please, Lauren. So how are the second line of defence addressing culture as a risk to the firm? In governance terms, the CEO often holds the senior manager prescribed responsibility. The first line of defence is the owner of the risk via its operational departments and the human resources function. Risk needs to monitor that first line of defence activity and report on it through the risk committee to the board. And increasingly, we are seeing cultural risk appetites being developed by the board, driven by the firm's value statement, and culture dashboards being developed with appropriate KRIs to attempt to monitor what is a relatively non-quantifiable risk. Culture overall is a matter of judgment, particularly good culture, and as such is a qualitative issue. The KRIs are probably more indicators than many examples of harder KRIs, such as an increasing ultimate loss ratio in a particular class of business. They also tend to measure poor rather than good behaviours. There are many KRIs that can be developed, but they probably all need to be seen as a whole rather than taken in isolation. And KRIs might include or be developed around the following potential data sources: complaints numbers and any root cause analysis, code of conduct breaches, repetitive breaches of underwriting limits, breaches of company policy and or procedures, failure to attend mandated or other training, whistleblowing reports, staff turnover statistics, leaver interview results, staff survey results. And Lloyds have provided many more examples within its toolkit. Next slide, please, Lauren. So how can firms get audit and assurance around this important topic? The third line of defence, or internal audit, is having to reflect in its work the first line of defence and second line of defence activity in planning its assurance work, as boards directly request it and other indirect guidance requires them to. Internal audit is required to think about it and report on it because it's directly called for in the Institute of Internal Auditors guidance on effective internal audit in the financial services sector. And remember, the regulators had input in developing this guidance. There is also an increasing body of indirect requirements and or guidance from other bodies as to how to think about the topic and to measure it. The revised UK Corporate Governance Code stresses company purpose and culture. New regulation now means directors have to report in the firm's financial statements on how they have met the Companies Act Section 172 requirements in their decision making. The Section 172 requirements are a high-level statement around the effective implementation of a company's purpose and its culture. The FCA have issued a discussion paper in March of this year on driving purposeful cultures in financial services. The discussion paper is a collection of essays from industry leaders, professional bodies, and culture experts exploring the role of purpose in driving a healthy, sustainable culture. And Lloyds has now added to the body of literature and guidance on this topic with its culture toolkit and other resources. And this is a very useful tool to apply as part of the assurance process. Next slide, please, Lauren. So as the provider of assurance, what does internal audit want to find evidence of? We've set out some of the fundamental characteristics that internal auditors might or should be thinking about as they go about their work. I will just pick out a few to talk about in greater detail in terms of how these characteristics might be evidenced in practice. Purpose, we've already discussed, but it comes down to, does the firm have appropriate value statements against which culture can be measured at the firm? Secondly, honesty might be evidenced by observation or by the outcomes of a firm's performance and development process through open and honest appraisal, reviews, and feedback. Reliability is evidenced through consistency in the message from the top in terms of both purpose, but also in the consistency of perhaps disciplinary process outcomes or intolerance within the first line of defense for policy and/or procedure breaches. Accountability, clarity of job description roles and reporting lines. Are these fit for purpose, updated appropriately, and actually used within the organization? Recognition, are the remuneration practices and other reward programs used consistently and openly, and are they applied across the firm? You might have others that you can add as part of your understanding of what characteristics might represent elements of a good culture. Next slide, please, Lauren. This last slide addresses some of the positive and negative indicators of culture within an organization. Some of these I've discussed previously, so I don't tend to repeat them now. But as I've observed over my years of involvement, many of the negative indicators in firms were in evidence, but that is changing, but perhaps too slowly. Having said that, cultural change is by its nature not prone to rapid change. Nowadays, the tone from the top is much more consistent and is open to challenge. In the past, a syndicate's active underwriter had a status akin to emperor, possibly even a dictator in his own domain. He had the required following from his capital providers to ensure the syndicate existed year after year. He decided what to underwrite and how and when, and he set the tone and the culture. And inevitably, some were better at this than others, and there are examples of both around the market. This has changed with the advent of integrated capital and related underwriting structures. The capital provider is now embedded in the organization and provides the strategy for the underwriter, who is now a cog in the senior management team. This has been a key cultural change. I've observed silos of culture as new underwriting and/or broking teams were brought into businesses, each retaining their own cultures, whether they were good or poor, in their new operating environment. A clique within a business with perhaps misaligned values. These were often given star performer status. They were recruited for a reason, and that was normally profit related. Not many recruiters asked, do these individuals or teams fit into the way we want to run our business? Or will they be cultural disruptors? The human resources function now has a much wider remit. It's not just the administrative provider of payroll and recruitment services, but is a crucial partner to the business in terms of developing and monitoring culture and ensuring that the best talent is both recruited and retained. It's the first line guardian of good cultural practice in terms of reward and recognition, and good performance management with transparent, open, and honest practices aligned to a firm's values and purpose. Solvency II, and more widely the development of corporate governance, have brought much change into our market in terms of setting out explicitly a firm's governance structure and the requirements for good and better resource compliance and risk functions and of course requiring an internal audit function as the provider of both assurance and of challenge in every underwriting firm. It has a crucial but difficult role to play in measuring and providing feedback on the culture environment. So how does the internal audit function carry this out? What tools does it use? How does it get the evidence? Is it through direct observation? Is it through internal audit cultural red flags during reviews, such as responsiveness to the audit, reaction to the issues raised, repetition of issues previously raised, etc.? There will be many other methods to review the positive and negative indicators, and best practice is still developing. However, the most difficult issue internal audit has to deal with is how does it call out poor culture, especially if it is perhaps a toxically poor culture. To whom are its observations made? How are its observations received? This is vital and is possibly the ultimate indicator of good or poor culture. Thanks for your time and attention. I'm now going to hand over to Clive, who will deal with change management.
Thank you, Charles. Yeah, hi everybody. My brief for today is to talk about, successful and genuine behavioural change in financial services, and to look at that from a change management perspective. So, what I'm not going to do is talk about change management in its basic settings, but take some 4 very applied lessons learned from real life examples and share those with you in the hope that it might be useful. We're able to do this today because of our formal relationship BDO has with ICG, Internal Consulting Group, which enables BDO clients to have access to 4,000 people just like me around the world, in addition to all of the BDO employees. Okay, so we're going to go fast to make up some time, so hold tight everyone, and let's look at these 4 lessons. So next slide, please, Lauren. Okay, so the first lesson is about linking programs and frameworks. Really important, this one. The example I give comes from a review I did of a culture change program in a bank. So financial institution. When I looked at it, I thought it was really great. I thought this is one of the best thought through culture change programs I've ever seen. It was well funded, it was properly structured, there were people sitting there, knew what they were doing, and they had thought through things like the balance between, high level banner type communications and, very importantly, sort of viral methods of getting messages out there, in particular exhibition of behaviours that they wanted to latch on through a viral approach. If that's not too bad a word, given COVID right now. So it was a fantastic program, except for one thing. And that one thing was the culture change program made no reference at all to the risk management framework. And I have to say vice versa. So, would that be a problem or not? Well, if you can see that there may be expressions of risk appetite or things that are permissible from a risk appetite perspective, that might be at odds with some of the behaviours being expressed in the culture programme or the culture programme strategy, then yes, it is a problem, because individuals at the other end of that don't know which one to go with. So in financial services, where risk is so integral, risk taking so integral to the business, how can you be confident of one without the other? So the first lesson is make sure there are linkages between culture change program and not just the risk management framework, but other things. And where you identify those linkages, make sure the quality of them and the thinking and the practice that's gone into them is good too. Okay, so that's the first lesson. We'll flip to the next slide now, please. Okay, so behavioural change techniques, and I put the little squared sign on for a reason. That we all kind of know, or at least will accept, that certain behavioural change techniques can be useful for some people in some situations when they're trying to achieve a particular result. So you might say, well, if that's true, why haven't they been used already in all of the change management initiatives that we've all seen and we've witnessed, in this market or elsewhere? Or maybe a better way to phrase this would be in a more positive way. And when you're trying to achieve change, positive phraseology is pretty helpful. How do I convince other people to use these behavioural change techniques? And it struck me that that's not too similar to the question, how do I get other people to think more about risk when they're making decisions, which one of the panelists earlier spoke about, I think it was Lindsay. because you're trying to persuade other people, maybe in this instance, underwriters, program managers, etc., to improve the way that they operate, even if they've been doing it the old way for 30 years. So how do you get them, how do you convince them to do this? Well, the answer, of course, is to use behavioural change techniques. And by that, I mean things like nudges, storytelling, and so on, when you're trying to convince others to operate differently. And the little squared thing I came earlier on is including when you're trying to get them to use behavioural change techniques, right, as part of a culture change program. You use your own behavioural change techniques to get them, convince them to use it elsewhere. And it's amazing how that is lost often on program managers and risk managers. I often ask heads of risk, what behavioural change techniques are you using to influence other people? And they'll usually come up with, well, we've got some training in, we're putting some comms out. But they often fall short and look a bit blank when I say, how are you using nudge theory, say? And of course, nudge theory has been used in many ways for a long time in the Lloyds London marketplace. If you think about it, and I'm sure you do, you know, what is one of the most successful nudges that's been used in the Lloyds marketplace for all these years? What is it? Well, what I think it is it's telling a managing agent that most of the other managing agents are already doing something in a different way. Right? You know, from working in the market, the minute you say that, those managing agents are far more inclined to want to do it that way as well. That is an example of nudge which works in this marketplace. So what I'm saying is use those in different ways and be smart about how they're used. So that's the second of 4 lessons. If we flip to the third one now, please. Right, you've got to really, really try if you want to be successful with this. Because the thing is, you know, half-hearted attempts at culture change, they might work. You might be lucky. You know, throw out a few emails, stick out a poster, run a workshop, or, you know, come up with a set of preferred behaviours, create a dashboard, something like that. And even maybe make some observations as to how executive management meetings or board meetings might work. So you could throw up all those things and take your chances. So do you feel lucky? But, you know, what if you don't want to leave it to luck? What if you really want to make sure this happens? You want to have the sort of confidence that would serve you and other stakeholders well moving forward. Well, the first bullet there on the right-hand side is you've got to map out all the things you need to do to be successful. And by that, I don't just mean all the future state items. So all those things that were in the maturity profiles that Lindsay went through, those are important because they give you direction. And I don't just mean milestones along the way. I mean, all the things you're going to have to do to create that movement, to create the momentum. So it's not just saying I'm going to start doing one of those things at the end. It's like, well, who do I need to influence now? How am I going to influence them? What evidence am I going to have to take? When am I going to take it to them? So it's mapping out all of those things, really, really important. And most people don't do it first time around. And then, of course, there's relating that set of initiatives then that you've had to others in the organization and how you can influence those other initiatives through your initiative. There'll be things like seeds you need to plant now for future benefits. So you've got to think through that temporal dimension of when the benefits will arise, so you don't miss the opportunity to plant some seeds now. And then, of course, you've got to think how you're going to deal really, really well with the detractors. You know, there'll be some people who are not up for change, don't really want to do it this way, whether they're, you know, verbal about it or whether it's other ways. Think about how you're going to deal with them in the organization, plan to deal with them. When they exhibit some of those behaviors, how will it be addressed? Build that into your planning. And then, of course, how will you remain agile? We've all seen how you can have massive changes in a short space of time. Things happen, things move. So when you've got your set program, think about what you would flex and when, and what you wouldn't flex and when. So your sort of elasticity of what you're trying to achieve is important to think through. And then, of course, you're thinking about who will we use and how will we monitor the progress we're making, and not just progress to date, because we all know with change management programs, everything's green until they're not anymore. But how do we get anticipation of whether we're on the right trajectory or not, given what we're trying to get to and when? So map it out. It tees you up for successful execution. And in that, I would just point out watch out for those little quips that people make that undermine progress. So there was an insurance company we're working with, talking to them via a video conference, and at the start of the video conference, someone said, oh yeah, I like these behaviours, the values, they're all really important to us. Of course, we couldn't live them every day. And I kind of knew where he was coming from on that, but in saying it, what he did was undermine that whole initiative. So again, think through how you deal with those quips, whether it's the start of a video call or when you get back to the office around your coffee machine, and be ready with the lines in response. Okay, if we go to the last lesson then. Thank you, Lauren. So next slide. Getting the culture thing changed to stick via bridging. Okay, you would think that strategy mapping, risk management, and people and behavior would be overlapping like they are in that top left diagram, that EULA diagram there. Because banking regulations, insurance regulations imply those linkages. But the reality, the frequent reality for some things is more what we see on the top right, where there are gaps and they're not these touch points between these items. Maybe the strategy guys aren't as well connected to risk as they should be, other than maybe elements of capital. Maybe risk guys are not that well connected with people driving behavior, and aspects of people risk are lighter, you know, that type of thing. So if it's logical to have them linked, but they're not there, then you need to create new activities for people to do in order that you do have those linkages which you know to be logically sound. And the thing about those new linkages is it takes bravery for people to do those new things, which is also a word used by Lindsay earlier on. So bravery in relation to those items, and all hail the bridgers, because they're the one that hold the key. And if you like that last phrase, then my very last slide here is a shameless plug. If we flick to the last slide, thanks, Lauren. It's a shameless plug for my new book, which I issued a couple of weeks ago. You can tell from the cover picture and from the title that it really is a risk management book, unlike all the others. And what we'll try to do is show that you can tell risk management stories in fun and entertaining ways, and you get some very deep insight and messages across in ways that you haven't seen before. So that's all from me. I hope those have been helpful. And Richard, back to you for Q&A.
Thanks very much, Clive. Well, I know what I can expect from you for Christmas. Sorry I disappeared off earlier on. I was having Zoom issues, but I understand that Shrenik was able to pick up seamlessly from where I left off. So we do have a few minutes to answer Q&A. I think those that we don't have a chance to cover off in the session, because I think we are going to need to try and stick to the time, we'll obviously try and come back to you on via email. So I'll take the first one, which I think is for you, Lindsay, around data for managing agents. I don't know if you want to cover that one off.
Yeah, sure. So this is about, so shall I just read it out? So it says, what level of data will be provided back to managing agents for what the findings of the market culture toolkit was, and will this be provided at managing agent level and shown relative to other managing agents? So yeah, so the answer to that is that's very much what we're aiming to do in terms of the culture sort of feedback from the survey. I guess the complication is around there needs to be a sort of minimum level of participation within organizations for us to be able to provide that data back to you to ensure anonymity, as well as you know, give a representative enough sample from your businesses. And then there's also the sort of the legal requirements around what we can do with the data. And I know that internally we're working with the external provider of the survey, plus our internal legal teams, drawing up the sort of the whatever legal documentation needs to be agreed in terms of the data. But certainly what we are aiming to do is to be able to feed that data back to you as managing agents, so that you can see where you are coming out of those surveys.
Thanks, Lindsay.
Then there was another question on the culture dashboard talks about risk innovation and adaptiveness to trends. So encouraging employees to be creative and demonstrate innovative ways of measuring risk. Have you any examples of where you've seen this done well, and how can this be evidenced? So I guess I would say to that one, I mean, you know, we haven't spent a lot of time talking to managing agents just yet about that, but certainly when I think about that internally, something like the syndicate in a box approach, which really allows innovative, brave thinking, but in a way that is sort of parameterized and safe. And I think that's an example. That kind of innovative, brave culture is encouraged, allowing people within the organization to be risky and to take make brave decisions, but be able to do that in a safe way. I would say that's probably a good example of that. And those kind of KPIs that we've built around the syndicate in a box, there's quite strict parameters if you're a syndicate in a box as to what you can and can't do. I think that that sort of builds the framework in which you can kind of evidence where you are on that, allowing that kind of type of innovative thinking within your business.
Lindsay, just on that one, I mean, Clive, I wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
Sorry, on the innovation point.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, probably from perhaps broader FS experience, given, as Lindsay said, the insurance guys are probably sort of work in progress at the moment, but I think a lot of it's transferable.
Yeah, I think there's a place for creativity in the marketplace. It has to be done with the right level of thought, because otherwise it can come across as gimmickry, and that's not what the market needs. But it seems to me, when you look at some of the progress which has not been made in banking and other places, the progress that has not been made, part of that is a lack of imagination, or a lack of courage, or a lack of bravery to go about things in new ways. And the thing about you'll get what you've always got if you do things the way you've always gone about it. That points us all to trying something new and trying different ways of working. So I think that'd be something that this insurance market can embrace and work with.
I know we've got one more question.
Yeah, I mean, let's do that one.
Last question.
Yeah, let's do it, Lindsay.
Great, no problem. So this was about whether at Lloyds we've applied or tested ourselves against the culture toolkit, and if so, what key advice would we give to managing agents as they try to engage with it? So yes, so the answer to that is yes. We certainly are going to be using the toolkit ourselves to measure ourselves on our own culture. I guess in terms of advice, I mean, almost what I said before, which is that it's a sort of pick and mix approach. Don't feel as though you need to sort of look at every line and tick every box. It's more about understanding your own business and being able to use the toolkit. You'll know which bits of the toolkit apply to your own business, and focusing your efforts on those, rather than just trying to kind of come up with a list of ticks from top to bottom, I would say would be my advice.
Brilliant. Okay, well, thanks very much for your attention, and thank you to all the speakers as well. I'm going to wrap up there. As Laura mentioned, we will be sending around the slides, and obviously if you do have any other questions that you want to direct towards BDO or towards Lindsay, then feel free to do so. And we also welcome any feedback that you might have. I mean, we're very happy to hold these sorts of sessions in the future as thinking evolves. And similarly, we're very happy to put together smaller working groups if that's something of interest. So if there are attendees out there who are wanting to be very proactive on this, do drop us a line, and we're happy to sort of facilitate more working group type sessions. But finally from me, thanks very much for your attention, and goodbye.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting us.